Hi, I'm Madelyn Dieffenderfer, and I'm here with
Aubrey Hetner
and
Paige Winters.
All of us are very interested in basketball, and the main event happening in the basketball world right now is the Women's March Madness tournament. This tournament has 68 teams in a single elimination bracket to eventually crown the champion of NCAAW Division I women's basketball. Before this tournament starts, it is known to fill out your own brackets and predict who you think the champion will be. All three of us have filled out our bracket for the women's tournament, and we'll be telling you what we are predicting to happen.
The first few games that we will be covering are the first four matchups. The first matchup in Albany 1 is 16 seed Sacred Heart versus 16 Presbyterian. For this game, I chose Sacred Heart.
I also chose Sacred Heart.
And I also chose Sacred Heart.
The next game is in Albany 2 for the 16 seed, which is Holy Cross versus UT Martin. I chose Holy Cross for this game.
I chose Holy Cross for this matchup.
And I also chose Holy Cross.
The next one is in Portland 3, and it's between 11 seed Auburn and 11 seed Arizona. For this matchup, I chose Arizona.
I also chose Arizona for this matchup.
And then I also chose Arizona.
The last one of the first four games is also in the Portland 3 region, and it's number 12 Vanderbilt versus number 12 Columbia. For this game, I chose Vanderbilt.
For this game, I chose Columbia.
I'm the same as Aubrey. I also chose Columbia.
Now we're moving on to the first round of the Albany 1 region. The first game is South Carolina versus the winner of Sacred Heart and Presbyterian. For this game, I chose South Carolina because they're just a very dominant team, and they've been undefeated this season. They haven't lost since they lost in the Final Four to Iowa last year.
Yeah, I also chose South Carolina for this matchup.
I chose South Carolina because they're a very dominant team.
The next game is 8 seed North Carolina versus 9 seed Michigan State. I chose Michigan State.
I chose North Carolina.
I chose Michigan State too.
The next matchup is number 5 Oklahoma versus number 12 FGCU. I chose Oklahoma.
I also chose Oklahoma.
I chose Oklahoma as well.
The next game is Indiana versus Fairfield. For this game, I chose Indiana, but I was on the fence between Indiana and Fairfield because Fairfield recently made it to the top 25 in the AP poll, and they've only lost like 1 or 2 games this season, I think, and they've been on a really good winning streak, but Indiana has Mackenzie Holmes, and she's pretty good.
I also chose Indiana. I feel like they have a really good team.
I chose Indiana because I thought they were pretty dominant this year.
The next game is 6-seeded Nebraska versus 11-seeded Texas A&M. For this game, I chose Nebraska. Jazz Shelley is just too good. Like, she has Caitlin Clark range, but it's not as good. And they also have Alexis Markowski in the paint.
I also chose Nebraska.
I chose Texas A&M just to be a little different. I thought they're a pretty good team.
The next matchup is 3-seeded Oregon State versus 14-seeded Eastern Washington. For this game, I chose Oregon State. I think they pulled off quite a few upsets against bigger teams this season.
I also chose Oregon State. They've come a long way this season.
I chose Oregon State just because they've been in the top 25 for almost, I think, the second half of the season.
Yeah, I think that's right. The next game is 7-seeded Ole Miss versus 10-seeded Marquette. I chose Ole Miss because I think they had a pretty good game against LSU. It was pretty close, I think. Don't quote me on that because I'm not sure.
I also chose Ole Miss.
I chose Marquette because they were in the top 25 a bunch this season, and I think they're a pretty good team.
The next game is 2-seeded Notre Dame versus 15-seed Kent State. I chose Notre Dame. They lost Olivia Miles to injury last year, I think, and she hasn't came back yet, but Hannah Hidalgo has really stepped up, and she's really good.
I also chose Notre Dame. I feel like Notre Dame is a very dominant team.
I chose Notre Dame too because they're very dominant, and I think they have a chance of going pretty far in this tournament. Now we're moving on to the round of 64 in the Albany 2 region. The first game is number 1 seeded Iowa versus the winner of the Holy Cross UT Martin game. I picked Iowa. They're a pretty dominant team this year.
I also picked Iowa.
I picked Iowa as well. They have Caitlin Clark, best player in the nation, and they also have Hannah Stalkey. She's really good too.
The next matchup is number 8 West Virginia versus number 9 Princeton. I picked West Virginia.
I picked Princeton. While they are lower seed than West Virginia, I feel like Princeton can definitely pull through.
I picked West Virginia. They've been in the top 25 quite a bit this season, I think.
The next game is 5-seeded Colorado versus 12-seeded Drake. I picked Colorado. They're a pretty good team.
I also picked Colorado.
I picked Colorado as well.
The next game is 4-seeded Kansas State versus 13-seeded Portland. I have Kansas State because they ended up upsetting Iowa. I mean, I wasn't very happy about that, but they are a pretty good team.
I also have Kansas State. I feel like they've come a really long way this season.
I also chose Kansas State. They've been playing really well this season.
The next matchup is 6-seeded Louisville versus 11-seeded Middle Tennessee. I picked Louisville for this matchup.
I also picked Louisville.
I also picked Louisville. They've been playing really well without Haley Van Lith.
The next game is 3-seeded LSU versus 14-seeded Rice. I have LSU winning this matchup, and I'm really excited to see what the next matchup for them will be.
I also have LSU. I feel like they're a very dominant team.
I picked LSU too, and I'm really looking forward to hopefully if Louisville wins their match, then they will play LSU. And I think that'll be a really good game for Haley Van Lith going against her old team.
The next game coming up is 7-seeded Creighton versus 10-seed UNLV. I have UNLV upsetting Creighton.
I have Creighton.
I have UNLV.
The next game is 2-seeded UCLA versus 15-seeded California Baptist. I have UCLA winning this game.
I also have UCLA. I feel like they've come a long way this season.
I picked UCLA. They have Kiki Rice. I think she runs point guard. I think. Don't quote me on that. And then they also have Lauren Betts in the paint. She's really good. The next set of games we're covering is the round of 64 in the Portland 3 region. The first matchup is USC versus Texas A&M CC. For this game, I have USC. They've been really good with Juju Watkins this year, and I think Juju Watkins is going to have a big game.
I also have USC. I feel like they are a very dominant team.
I have USC, and Juju Watkins I think will be phenomenal for them.
The next game is 8-seeded Kansas versus 9-seeded Michigan. For this game, I have Michigan pulling off the upset. Michigan has played really well this season. Yeah.
I also have Michigan. I feel like they can definitely pull off this game.
I picked Kansas for this matchup.
Okay. The next game is 5-seeded Baylor versus the winner of the Vanderbilt-Columbia game. I picked Baylor for this game because they've been really well this season.
Yeah, I also picked Baylor. I feel like they've been really good.
I picked Baylor because they've been in the top 25 for a good part of the season.
The next game is 4-seeded Virginia Tech versus 13-seeded Marshall. For this game, I chose Virginia Tech. I'm hoping that they'll have Elizabeth Kitley back, but if they don't, then that's going to affect my bracket because I don't think they're going to do very good. But Georgia Moore should carry them for the most part.
Yeah, I also have Virginia Tech for this game.
I have Virginia Tech for this game too. I think Georgia Moore will be very good for them.
The next game is 6-seeded Syracuse versus 11-seeded either Arizona or Auburn. For this game, I have Arizona because they have freshman Jada Williams. She's been playing really good this season. Syracuse also has, what's her name? Daisha Fair or something. She is up there in all-time points, I think.
I have Syracuse. I feel like they've been really good this season.
I have Arizona pulling up the upset.
The next game is 3-seeded UConn versus 14-seeded Jackson State. I have UConn. They went through a lot of adversity this year with injuries. I think they only have 8 players available for the entire tournament. That might affect them in the later rounds, but I don't think it'll have any effect against a 14 seed.
I have UConn for this too. I feel like they're a very dominant team and can definitely pull off this one.
I think UConn will pull it off. I think Paige Beckers and Aaliyah Edwards will be very phenomenal for them in this game.
And Aaliyah Edwards is coming back with a broken nose. She's coming back with the mask again.
There she goes.
The next game is 7-seeded Duke versus 10-seeded Richmond. For this game, I have Duke.
I also have Duke for this game.
I have Duke, but I was very close on picking Richmond.
The last game in the Portland 3 region for the round of 64 is 2-seeded Ohio State versus 15-seeded Maine. I have Ohio State. They upset Iowa earlier in the season. I think it was once, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They split they split their games with Iowa.
I also have Ohio State. I feel like they've come really far this year.
I have Ohio State too. They've been super dominant this whole season. The final games in the round of 64 is the Portland 4 region. The first game is 1-seeded Texas versus 16-seeded Drexel. I have Texas winning this game.
I also have Texas winning this game.
I have Texas as well. They have, I think, Madison Booker. She's a freshman. She's been playing really well with Rory Harmon out this season.
The next game is 8-seeded Alabama versus 9-seeded Florida State. I got Alabama winning this game.
I also have Alabama. I feel like they can pull it off.
I have Alabama too. They have a really good team.
Next is 5-seeded Utah versus 12-seeded South Dakota State. I have Utah winning this game.
I also have Utah.
I have Utah as well. They have Alyssa Pillai on their team, and she's been helping them a lot throughout the season.
The next matchup is 4-seeded Gonzaga versus 13-seeded UC Irvine. I have Gonzaga winning this game.
I also have Gonzaga winning this game. I feel like they've come a long way.
I have Gonzaga. They've been in the top 25 for at least the last half of the season, I think.
The next game is 6-seeded Tennessee versus 11-seeded Green Bay. I have Tennessee winning this game.
I also have Tennessee winning this game.
I have Tennessee as well.
The next matchup is 3-seeded NC State versus 14-seeded Chattanooga. I have NC State winning this game. They've been pretty good this season, and they've been in the top 25 a lot.
I also have NC State. I feel like they're a pretty dominant team.
I have NC State too.
The next game is 7-seeded Iowa State versus 10-seeded Maryland. I have Maryland pulling off the upset.
I have Iowa State, although I almost did pick Maryland.
I have Maryland pulling off the upset as well. They have really good guards. I think they have Cheyenne Sellers, Brene Alexander, and then they have really good paint presence too.
Final game of the round of 64 is 2-seeded Stanford versus 15-seeded Norfolk State. I have Stanford winning this game.
I also have Stanford winning this game.
I have Stanford winning this game. I think the duo of Cameron Brink and Kiki Ariafen is too powerful to beat.
I do think Cameron Brink will play pretty good in that game.
Yeah.
We're now moving on to the round of 32 in the Albany 1 region. We'll each state who we have in the game and who we think are going to win because now our brackets can be different. The first game, I have South Carolina versus Michigan State, and I have South Carolina winning this game.
I have South Carolina versus North Carolina, and I have South Carolina winning this game.
I have South Carolina and Michigan State, and I have South Carolina because they'll have Camila Cardoso back. She got the suspension for the first game, but they'll be fine.
The next game is Oklahoma versus Indiana. I have Indiana winning this game.
I have Oklahoma and Indiana, and I have Oklahoma winning this game. I feel like they can pull it off.
I have Oklahoma versus Indiana, and I have Oklahoma pulling it off.
In the next game, I have Texas A&M and Oregon State. I have Oregon State winning this game.
I have Nebraska and Oregon State, and I have Oregon State winning this game.
I have Nebraska and Oregon State, and I have Nebraska pulling off the upset and beating Oregon State. Jazz Shelley is just too much to handle.
The next game, I have Marquette versus Notre Dame, and I have Notre Dame, and I think they're going to win by a good amount.
I have Ole Miss and Notre Dame, and I also have Notre Dame. I feel like they will also win by a pretty good amount.
I also have Ole Miss versus Notre Dame, and I have Notre Dame coming out on top. Now on to the round of 32 in the Albany 2 region. The first matchup is Iowa versus West Virginia, and West Virginia is not sending Caitlin Clark packing, and Iowa is beating them.
I have Iowa and Princeton, and I had Iowa winning this game because they are a very dominant team.
I have Iowa and West Virginia, and I think Caitlin Clark is going to make them win by a huge margin, and they're moving on.
Yeah. The next game is Colorado versus Kansas State, and I have Colorado pulling off the upset against Kansas State. They've been playing really well this season.
I have Colorado and Kansas State as well, and I also have Colorado pulling this win off.
I have Colorado and Kansas State, and I have Kansas State winning this game.
The next matchup is Louisville versus LSU. This is going to be a really good game with Haley Vinlith playing her former team, but I think LSU is still going to beat Louisville.
I also have Louisville and LSU, and I feel like LSU will definitely win this game.
I have Louisville and LSU. I really want this game to happen, so I hope they end up winning the first round, but I have LSU winning this game.
And then the last game is UNLV and UCLA, and I have UCLA winning.
I have Creighton and UCLA, and I have UCLA winning this game.
I have UNLV and UCLA. I think UCLA is just way too dominant. We're now moving on to the round of 32 in the Portland 3 region. The first game I have is USC versus Kansas, and I have USC winning this game.
I have USC and Michigan, and I have USC winning this game.
I also have USC and Michigan, and I have USC winning.
The next game I have is Baylor versus Virginia Tech. I have Virginia Tech winning this game. I think they'll play very well.
I also have Baylor and Virginia Tech winning this game, and I think Virginia Tech is going to win.
I have Baylor and Virginia Tech, and I have Virginia Tech. Hopefully Elizabeth Kitley will be back at this point, but if not, they still should win.
The next matchup I have is Arizona versus UConn, and I have UConn winning this game. I really hope Paige Beckers has a really good game.
I have Syracuse and UConn, and I have UConn definitely pulling this game off because they have Paige Beckers, and she's really good.
I have Arizona versus UConn, and I have UConn pulling it off.
The next game in this region is Duke versus Ohio State, and I have Ohio State winning this game. They've been very dominant this year.
I also have Duke and Ohio State, and I think Ohio State will win this game.
I also have Duke and Ohio State, and I think Ohio State will win. The final round of 32 matchups are in the Portland 4 region, and for the first game, I have Texas versus Alabama, and I have Texas coming out on top.
I also have Texas and Alabama, and I have Texas winning.
I have Texas and Alabama, and I think Texas is going to win. They're a pretty dominant team this season.
The next game that I have is Utah versus Gonzaga, and I have Utah pulling off the upset. They've been playing really good this season.
I also have Utah versus Gonzaga, and I feel like this would be a really good game, but I feel like Gonzaga is going to pull off the win.
I have Utah and Gonzaga, and I think Utah's going to win.
The next game that I have is Tennessee versus NC State, and I have Tennessee upsetting NC State because I feel like Tennessee has more paint presence with Rakia Jackson.
I have Tennessee versus NC State, and I have NC State winning.
I have Tennessee versus NC State, and I think NC State's going to win just because they've been in the top 25 a bunch this year, and they're a pretty good team.
And then the last game that I have is Maryland versus Stanford, and I have Stanford winning. I feel like no one can beat Cameron Brink at this early in the tournament.
I have Iowa State versus Stanford, and I have Stanford winning. I just feel like they're a pretty dominant team.
I have Maryland versus Stanford, and I think Stanford's going to win this game. Now we're moving on to the Sweet 16 in the Albany 1 region. The first game that I have is South Carolina versus Indiana, and I have South Carolina winning this game.
The first game I have is South Carolina versus Oklahoma, and I have South Carolina winning.
I also have South Carolina versus Oklahoma, and I have South Carolina winning. I feel like they can't be beaten this early before the Final Four.
The next game in the Albany 1 region that I have is Oregon State versus Notre Dame, and I have Notre Dame winning this game. They're a pretty dominant team, and I think they have a chance of going far.
I also have Oregon State versus Notre Dame, but I have Oregon State winning.
I have Nebraska versus Notre Dame, and I have Notre Dame winning. I feel like Hannah Hidalgo and Maddie Westfeld are just a very good duo, and I don't think that Nebraska and Jazz Shelley are going to beat them. Now on to the Sweet 16 in the Albany 2 region. The first game that I have is Iowa versus Colorado, and I have Iowa winning. I feel like it's going to be a really close game, but Iowa's going to come out on top, and Caitlin Clark's going to hit some clutch shots.
I have Iowa versus Colorado, and I feel like Iowa's going to win. They have been a really dominant team.
I have Iowa versus Kansas State, and I think Iowa's going to pull it out, but I feel like Kansas State might be a good matchup for them. They lost to them earlier this season, so they better play pretty hard.
The next game is LSU versus UCLA, and I have UCLA winning. I feel like this is going to be a really close game again. I feel like UCLA is going to have, they have better guards than LSU. LSU has Anissa Mora and Angel Reese, but UCLA has the guards.
I also have LSU versus UCLA, and I feel like although this will be a really good game, I feel like UCLA is going to win.
I have LSU versus UCLA, and I think LSU is going to win. I really want to see the matchup of Iowa versus LSU, which was the final last year, so I think it'll be a pretty good game. The next two Sweet 16 matches are in the Portland 3 region. The first game that I have is USC versus Virginia Tech, and I think USC is going to win this game, most likely probably by a big margin.
I also have USC versus Virginia Tech, and I feel like USC is definitely going to pull this one off.
I have USC versus Virginia Tech, and I have USC winning because Virginia Tech is now without Elizabeth Kitley after she went down with a torn ACL.
The next game is UConn versus Ohio State, and I have UConn winning this game. I really want them to do good in the tournament. They're a good team. They just struggle with injuries.
I also have UConn versus Ohio State, and I have UConn pulling this off. I have Paige Winters, so
I have UConn and Ohio State, and as long as UConn doesn't get into any early foul trouble, then they'll be fine because they only have 3 bench players. The final 2 Sweet 16 matchups are in the Portland 4 region. The first game that I have is Texas versus Utah, and I have Utah pulling off the upset.
I have Texas versus Gonzaga, and I have Texas pulling this one off.
I have Texas versus Utah, and I have Texas winning this game.
The last game is Tennessee versus Stanford, and I have Stanford beating Tennessee.
I have NC State versus Stanford, and I have NC State winning this game.
I have NC State versus Stanford, and I have Stanford winning this game. I think it might be a close game. They're both very dominant teams, but I think Stanford's winning. We're now going on to the Elite 8 in the Albany 1 region. I have South Carolina versus Notre Dame, and I have South Carolina winning this game. I think it'll be a close game. I want Notre Dame to win, but I don't think they're going to.
I have South Carolina versus Oregon State, and I have South Carolina winning.
I have South Carolina versus Notre Dame, and I think that South Carolina is going to pull through. The next Elite 8 matchup is in the Albany 2 region, and I have Iowa versus UCLA, but I have Iowa winning this one. I feel like Caitlin Clark and Kate Martin are going to dominate UCLA.
I have Iowa versus UCLA as well, and I feel like this will be a really good game, but I feel like Iowa is going to win.
I have Iowa versus LSU. I think this will be a good game if it is the matchup of the final. I have Iowa winning this game, but I think there's a chance of it being close. The matchup I have in the Portland 3 region in the Elite 8 round is USC versus UConn, and I have UConn winning this game. I think it'll be a close game, but I'm hoping and praying that UConn will come out of it.
I have USC versus UConn as well, and I have UConn winning this game. I feel like it'll be a really good and close game, but I hope they can pull it off.
I have USC versus UConn, and as long as UConn can shut down Juju Watkins, then they will advance to the next round. The final Elite Eight matchup is in the Portland 4 region, and I have Utah versus Stanford, and I have Stanford winning.
I have Texas versus NC State, and I have Texas winning. They are a very dominant team.
I have Texas versus Stanford, and I have Stanford winning this game. I just think Cameron Brink will be too hard to beat. We're now on to the final 4 matchups. And the first game I have is South Carolina versus Stanford, and I have South Carolina winning this game.
I have South Carolina versus Texas, and I have South Carolina winning this game.
I have South Carolina versus Stanford. I think it's going to be a really close game, but I think South Carolina is going to pull it out.
The final game in the Final Four that I have is Iowa versus UConn, and I have Iowa winning this game. I think they'll just be too dominant for UConn.
I have Iowa and UConn as well, and I feel like this will be a good game, but I feel like Iowa is going to win.
I have Iowa versus UConn, and this is going to be a really good matchup between Caitlin Clark and Paige Winters, but I think Caitlin Clark's going to come out on top with her team. The final game of the tournament is the national championship, and I have a rematch of last year's Final Four between South Carolina and Iowa, and I have a repeat of last year with Iowa winning.
I have South Carolina versus Iowa, and I have Iowa winning.
I have South Carolina versus Iowa, and I have Iowa winning. I just think Iowa's going to be able to snap their undefeated streak.
And I think that this is going to be Caitlin Clark's revenge tour. This concludes our Women's 2024 NCAA March Madness predictions. After a champion is crowned, we will update you all with how we thought the tournament went and who had the most accurate bracket out of the 3 of us.